Yeah, on behalf of Friederike Lausch and me, we are looking forward to the last lecture of our series tonight with our guest speaker, Juliane Richter from Bauhaus-University in Weimar. And her talk has the title, one moment to give the right title, Researching and Building from, for, and within the Socialist Tropics, Exploring Networks, Institutionalization, and the Role of the Institute for Tropen und Auslandsbau in the GDR. This lecture series received the kind support and sponsoring from Vereinigung von Freunden der Technischen Universität zu Darmstadt and the Center for Critical Studies in Architecture. This lecture series is part of a research seminar here at the University of Darmstadt on the history of the Institut oder Arbeitsgruppe für tropisches Bauen at the former TH Darmstadt. And unfortunately, our seminar is coming to an end. Currently, our students are working on contributions to a research blog, a virtual exhibition of research results that will be published and made available for further research and study. And yeah, last year we had the opportunity to listen to Rachel Lee and Monika Motilinska on the German architect and entrepreneur Georg Lipsmeier and his global engagement in the field of tropical architecture, followed by a lecture of Dan Theodorowicz from Stuttgart, together with Jörg Sierig, on the broader picture of West German universities and their engagement in development planning, including TH Darmstadt. And last but not least, we had Sebastian Losen with us, who displayed the fascinating research, teaching, and learning developed at the Postgraduate Center for Human Settlements at the University of Leuven in Belgium. And tonight, I'm happy to introduce to you our guest speaker, journalist and historian Juliane Richter. Currently, Juliane is an associated scientist in the Freigeist project titled Conquering with Concrete, German construction companies as global players in local contexts, and which is funded by the Volkswagen Foundation. And it takes part in the Leibniz Institute for Regional Development and Structural Planning, IRS, in Erkner at the outskirts of Berlin. And Juliane is concluding her PhD thesis in the DFG Research Training Group, Identity and Heritage at the Bauhaus-University Weimar on research topics related to the circulation of architectural knowledge between the former GDR and socialist Cuba. Yeah, feel free to ask questions and share your thoughts in the chat, either in English or in German. And after Juliane's talk, we will have the chance to come together and discuss yeah, the topics we were talking about in our series. And yeah, I think for now that's enough from my from my side. Juliane, the screen is yours. I'm not sure if I can if you can share your presentation. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Wonderful.
I will do this now.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. I hope you can hear me well. And thank you for the invitation to present here in the framework of this very nice lecture series, I guess. Today we will look on, let's say, the other side of the so-called Iron Curtain to learn how the topic of building abroad and in hot and humid climates was discussed and practiced at research institutions in the East. Part of the talk will be to show that the wall was not as impenetrable as the word might suggest. In order to illustrate this, I want to present you in German, it's the Wissenschaftsbereich Tropen und Auslandsbau. In German, in English, it would be Scientific Department of Building and Tropics and Abroad at the University of Architecture and Civil Engineering in Weimar. This scientific department of building in the tropics and abroad was established at the University of Architecture and Civil Engineering in Weimar in the mid-1980s. It became a hub for advanced training programs for architects and engineers from the GDR and from abroad, as well as for German students who wanted to further qualify themselves and specialize on building in the tropics. On this point, I want to point out the important difference in the terms. Building in the tropics and not tropical architecture. Building in the Tropics emphasizes the process and conditions of building in humid, hot climates and not the character of architecture itself. I will also use the term tropics, which imagines not only a certain place or landscape, or even a climate zone, but rather a political and social cultural space, as already mentioned by different authors before. Plus, I use tropics as a term of the sources. So this is shortly the outline of my presentation today, which will take around 40 minutes. I hope not as long as 40, maybe 35 minutes. And at first, I want to introduce you a bit more to the context of this institute. So I will talk about the broader context of the GDR and the so-called, maybe we could today call it the so-called Global South. I sub-headlined it with between aid, trade, and international solidarity. So in the GDR context, institutions like this institute stand in a series of projects carried out under the umbrella of international solidarity with countries that were in the process of decolonization and on the socialist development path. Instead of development aid, like the Federal Republic of Germany, the GDR granted economic and scientific technical cooperation with the aim of, I quote, equalizing the level of economic development and providing all-round help and support to industrially less developed countries. So services from the building sector were also part of this. And the transnational flow of architecture and knowledge, there is an, quote, ambiguous relationship between gift-giving and commercial exchange, quote, and as Lucas Stanek put it. The ambiguity of these two-sided transfers was mainly due to the fact that they included ethically and morally based support and construction services, as well as scientific cooperation between universities or architectural buildings as objects of exchange for raw materials or hard currencies. As material resources, technology and expertise traveled, international assistance also promoted an ethos of horizontal solidarity, that is, of non-hierarchical cooperation. Hilfe, aid, was thus thought to be distinct from the paternalist and neocolonial politics of pity that informed aid from the capitalist West. Behind this stood the overall assumption of the GDR rationale that the state was not building upon the colonial project. In contrast to the Federal Republic of Germany, the GDR was able to claim that there was a new state, an anti-fascist, socialist, anti-imperialist state with no continuity to Germany's colonial past. I think this mindset also explains the idea of an encounter on equal footing with the countries of the Global South. For example, in the official GDR narratives, comparisons were often drawn between GDR history and the history of Cuba, as of two states that had to completely rebuild themselves after historical upheaval. The fact that the economic and geopolitical situation was by no means comparable, and that there have been, of course, personal or institutional continuities from colonial Germany, were often swept under the carpet. So the focus of these GDR solidarity services was on countries like Nicaragua, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Cuba, Mongolia, Mozambique, Angola, Ethiopia, Yemen, Syria, and Algeria. So these were all countries which were at different points of times within a decolonization process, or countries on a way towards socialism, or at least somehow anti-imperialist. So this was something also a bit blurry. Bruderstaaten in German, or in English, fraternal countries, as they were also called. These observed or imagined political ideological similarities also defined the research focus of area studies, in German, Regionalwissenschaften, regional studies, they were called, which evolved or were new established in the late 1950s and 60s at GDR universities, for example, the African studies at the University of Leipzig. And these area studies also formed an epistemic branch that informed the chairs that later emerged that had to do with building in the tropics, or had studied building in the tropics. Area studies, not just in the GDR, dealt with groups of countries outside Europe, which were often equated with developing countries. But the specificity of the GDR lies in the fact that, for example, at the if we talk about the Latin American studies at the University of Rostock, the selection of countries mostly laid on Chile or Cuba and their revolutionary or socialist periods, and was, at least until the 1980s, mostly dominated by historical, ideology critical, and revolutionary theoretical approaches. So this is why I mentioned the socialist tropics in the headline of my talk today, because there was a certain narrowing down the pool of the countries that were studied. And this also applied to the study of building in the tropics. Although there was, of course, there were also exceptions, like, for example, the more capitalist countries of the United Arab Emirates, which have also been the target of concrete construction projects, as well as scientific research and exchange. But I think this was would go too far to go into it today. What is more, when we talk about the specificities of researching building in the tropics or researching these countries, is we see an intertwining with a commercial aspect, the establishment of such courses like area studies, and also like Building in the Tropics Institute, which I talk about it later. The establishment of these courses and the investment in training and language skills and legal issues and intercultural skills was linked to a political ideological goal and a mission to make people fit for working abroad, for example, to conclude trade contracts. At the same time, these assignments were always politically charged, as the people who were allowed to go abroad, and these were only selected people, did not represent a company or even just a university, as would be the case maybe in a capitalist system, but the state itself. Of course, always there are exceptions, but I generalize here, but to give it just a bit a short overview. Also about the difficult differences to when we talk about these same courses in the Federal Republic of Germany. But we can talk about it later also in the discussion, I guess. I come back to the title of my presentation again. There was a building for the socialist tropics, but from a geographical distant vantage point, namely the GDR itself. And these geographical distant points were not easy to overcome these days. So there were several conditions and constraints of researching building in the tropics in the GDR. Firstly, travel restrictions and long application periods for being able to travel. This applies particularly for the students in the tropical building courses, as they could actually be sure to not go to the places they were studying, as this quote by a former student makes clear. There was a reduction of professional contacts, especially to the capitalist countries. This is very generally spoken. We will see afterwards that in particular examples there have been relations and intense and very close contacts between the institutions and actors in East and West, also regarding exchange of publications and literature, but it was not officially endorsed. There was a foreign trade monopoly of the state and intimidation of foreign trade companies, also in higher education. Another constraint was the non-convertibility of the mark of the currency. Therefore, also no direct access to funds for self-initiated project financing. So to give you more about the context where you could study building in the tropics in the East, I will go a bit behind the boundaries of the GDR. In the Federal Republic of Germany, you already talked about different courses, I think, in Europe before, so I will not talk about this again, but just briefly, in the Federal Republic of Germany, courses with so-called third world orientation were offered since the 1960s. And you already heard about the non-university research institutes like Lipsmeier's Institute for Tropical Architecture. But what about the so-called second world, about the term from Lukas Stanek again, so the socialist countries in the European East? In Poland, the Institute for Tropical Architecture Research was founded at Gdańsk University of Technology in 1972, and the International Postgraduate Course of Urban and Regional Planning for Developing Countries at the Czech University of Technology in 1965, which by 1992 had trained around 500 graduates from 47 Asian, African, and Latin American countries in architecture, geography, ecology, civil engineering, with reference to their home countries. Researchers at the Patrice Lumumba University in Moscow authored guidelines and manuals that were used by Soviet architects abroad and were distributed within the socialist bloc. These research centers, supported by a growing number of institutes specializing in area studies, and by architecture and planning departments and other higher education institutions, examined urbanization process in Africa and Asia, studied appropriate architecture and engineering solution, and sometimes compiled market studies for state socialist enterprises that operated abroad. So compared to these countries, systematic research on questions of technologies, design, or the social cultural impact of building in the tropics is institutionalized late in the GDR. Although in practice, the aspects of climatic adapted architecture, for example, were already considered in projects built in the early 1960s, as these two examples I show here today, prove. We know for sure that contemporary international literature on these topics was available, read, and applied by GDR architects and engineers. When it came to practical questions of architecture and civil engineering in the tropics, several institutions in the GDR turned its attention to it. So I will just name them very generally. That there were constructive questions which were dealt with at the Technical University of Dresden, and the building climatology faculty or institute, maybe. The Bauhaus-University of the GDR, the Central Scientific Institution for Architecture and Construction and Research and Practice, turned its attention to this in the so-called Muster- und Experimentalprojekt. So it was a kind of department. In individual institutes, for example, at the Institute for Technology and Mechanization on Building with Earth Construction Materials, and the Institute for Urban Planning and Architecture. I already mentioned area studies at different universities in Berlin, Halle, Leipzig, and Rostock mainly, and at the Akademie der Wissenschaften. And also construction companies were involved in these topics. For example, the IPO Dessau, Industrieprojekt Dessau, research on behavior of concrete in tropical climate. And we also have further training institutes in Leipzig and in Weimar. But in general, we can observe that this research was only dispersed. Against this background, the University of Weimar built a crucial role already before the 1980s, and the funding of the Wissenschaftsbereich Tropen und Auslandsbau. I will talk to you now, finally, in detail. Maybe you can add this name is a bit strange maybe today, Wissenschaftsbereich. It's like an Institute, we would say in German, but it related to the Weiterbildungsinstitut, to the Further Training Institute, which was part of the university, but also subordinated to the Ministry of Hoch- und Fachschulwesen of the GDR. So the Wissenschaftsbereich was more like an interdisciplinary institute, which was not just part of the architectural engineering faculty, for example. So the University of Weimar already had been a hub for the education of architecture students and scientists from abroad since many years. These exchanges were part of cooperation agreements under the title of Scientific Technical Assistance, which were launched by the government. From the late 1960s until the mid-1980s, more than 400 foreign students received diplomas in Weimar, and over 70 earned doctorates with topics often related to the practical or theoretical problems of their home countries. Besides the conference from other socialist states, mostly international students came from Vietnam, Cuba, Syria, Yemen, Ethiopia, and Algeria. So the institute was founded in the department was founded in 1985, and an outcome of both political, economic, as well as individual efforts from experienced personnel on the ground. So first, the goal or the motivation of founding such an institute from the top-down perspective was to increase the export volume. The GDR trading officials were seeking for ways to increase the export volume of their export companies, the foreign trade organizations or Außenhandelsbetriebe, to gain more hard currency by selling construction expertise and projects to foreign states. And for this, they sought for the cooperation between universities and companies. And secondly, the role of the individual actors. Person networks, research topics, practical experience of architects returning from construction sites abroad. So there was an intrinsic motivation to systemize knowledge, to conduct experiments outside the norms and key figures, to provide possibilities of traveling abroad, which led also to the founding of this institute. Maybe in this regard, you could also compare it a bit to the courses of the Federal Republic in Germany of Darmstadt, or to the design build movement, I guess. One of these actors is Hans-Ulrich Mönnig, a civil engineer who before worked in Vinh, Vietnam, where the GDR built an entire city quarter in the 1970s. Hans-Ulrich Mönnig then became the head of the scientific department with its foundation in 1985. So this department employed up to 17 team members in the department, 17 team members, including some doctoral candidates who were also part of the scientific and teaching staff. Among them, several assistants also from foreign countries, as well as teaching staff from the other universitarian departments, as well as experts working in related fields. So these are maybe the international connections which were mostly evident. It's mostly Mozambique, Yemen, Cuba, Vietnam, Cambodia. What else do we have? Syria. You can see it. And I will go now show you a bit of the fields of activity of this department. So firstly, it was, of course, the training for construction practitioners abroad as part of the already mentioned Further Training Institute of Weimar. The teaching of students from the GDR and from abroad, again, mostly from these fraternal states. In this framework, also students from these countries conducted their doctorate in Weimar. And I've just listed some topics of seminars for you here. So the names, as they were, it's written in the archives: traditional building in Latin America, traditional architecture in Islamic influenced countries. Here you could see also how they work together with the area studies, in this case of Halle, or with the University of Leipzig when it came to traditional building in sub-Saharan Africa. Actually, the name was a bit different. The name of the seminar was Socio-Economic Processes and Developments in Sub-Saharan Africa. So it was not about building from these area studies, but when it came to the social or historical questions, the teaching staff from the area studies from these other departments were called to teach the courses. And of course, we have also topics on engineering, tropical soils, climatic adapted construction methods, regional planning, or as they call it, situationally appropriate construction, situationsgerechte Bauweise. The unique character of the department was that it wasn't only about construction questions of building in hot and dry or humid climate. Instead of a more comprehensive perspective should be taken, and research in the fields of technology and materials and social, cultural, and ethnographic sciences were combined. They conducted several practical seminars in 2 weeks courses where the students had to fulfill design tasks like, you can see it here, village planning in Tanzania, wohnen in housing in Hanoi, ecological tourism in Cuba. This was after 1990, I have to add. So we go to after 1990 here as well. As I said, it was just founded in 1985 and existed until 1993. But I guess, I come to one example a bit later where you could see that it's also like after transformation of the GDR also played a role. yeah, and after 1990, these practical seminars were also conducted together with students from the Federal Republic of Germany. So, for example, also from Kaiserslautern. Maybe also Darmstadt, I'm not so sure. Could be. There were yearly internships on a construction site in Herbsleben, in Saxony-Anhalt, to build houses from clay, Lehmbau workshop, they called it. In this case, they built a youth club, which still exists today. And another field of activity was also consultancy, which was, of course, the job of the teachers. For example, here, Hans-Ulrich Mönnig prepared an expert opinion in the case of a legal dispute over damages between two foreign trade companies, to put it very briefly, on a textile production plant in Tanzania. And of course, which was also important, the international, under the umbrella of this international scientific cooperation, again, a state-controlled way of designing international relations under these friendship agreements between the universities, which also provoked inter-block exchange, as you can see here. And what is important to mention here, of course, personal friendships and informal networks grew out of this as well. Which you can also see like in the sources very well, that this was not like this level of friendship was already in the picture here. So, and to mention also the international networks. Besides the above mentioned countries, they had the closest ties and exchange with Switzerland, with the ETH Zürich, and the Federal Republic with Kaiserslautern, Darmstadt, Kassel, and Stuttgart. I did not find anything about connection to Lipsmeyer's Institute, although you would guess when you see the name of it, of the institute, that of course it played a role as a role model, and it did, according to Hans-Ulrich Mönnig, but there was no direct contact. And of course, they had all the literature from there in Weimar. And yeah, what also worth mentioning, the trial network, we already talked about this before in one of your lectures, and the UN Habitat, in this case, for example, as a design competition for a refugee shelter for the ANC in Dakar in Tanzania, where the students took part. And it was also conducted in a way. There is now a research project at the Bauhaus in Dessau about this, about this camp. So I come back to the title of my presentation, building for, from, and within the socialist tropics. When you talk about building from the socialist tropics, I'm mainly referring to the study of so-called traditional building techniques and practices in these countries. For example, when teachers from the department went abroad to give lectures or seminars, they carried out fieldwork and research in these countries, as when they studied adobe construction in Yemen, which then served as models for their own building experiments, the education seminar and lecture program, and the department's publications. So as an example here, photographs from Hans-Ulrich Mönnig's trip to Cuba, and a later article about this specific kind of construction method technique in Cuba, keyword appropriate building techniques. Or they also did publications together with their partners. As here, example, is here a dictionary on, Fachwörter der Bereiche Architektur und Bauingenieurwesen in German and Spanish. And also dissertations grew out of this. For example, one member of the department conducted a survey among so-called Auslandskader to find out about the social cultural impact of the construction experts projects in the target countries, which is, I think, very interesting. Yeah, maybe I don't have to go into this so far. These are some titles of dissertations were conducted, and of course also doctoral theses from students from abroad were conducted there. And lastly, building from and within the socialist tropics. I come to within, and to show you some example of architecture which was actually built. So for the students, these studies remained theoretical since traveling was limited. But because of the transformation in 1990, they could put one of the very few practical projects abroad into practice. And so an excursion took place when 6 students were able to go to Havana, Cuba. Led by one member of the scientific department, Horst Schröder, their task was to construct the Coco Solo experimental house within 6 weeks. As a residential building of 6 apartments based on self-made air-dried bricks using the local earth material. They planned to work with clay based on their own experience with clay construction in Herbstleben, and build the house together with unskilled workers with the aim of establishing the self-construction technique in Havana. The Cuban partner was the Centro de Estudios de Construcción y Arquitectura Tropical, a tropical construction institute at the Technical University of Havana, which was founded in 1989 on the initiative of the former Weimar doctoral student and Cuban Ruben Bancroft Hernandez. So maybe you can also talk about knowledge transfer here in this regard. Although the scope and the focus of this institute was very different from that one in Weimar. The workload was clearly divided. The Cuban side determined the construction site and designed the plans, as we can see here. And the group from Weimar was responsible for the execution, together with the Cuban micro brigade. A micro brigade is a Cuban model of self-building formed by a group of workers from a factory or an own office who were set free from their regular duties in order to build houses for themselves and their colleagues. When I read the report from the trip or the talk to the contemporary witnesses, I observe quite different perceptions of the project. From Horst Schröder, the head of the excursion team from Weimar, from his point of view, the execution of the project was not to the satisfaction of the Weimar group. The University of Havana had apparently not provided any technical guidance to the workshop, which was responsible for the micro brigade. There was no site manager with master craftsmen or skilled worker qualifications available, so that Horst Schröder was immediately made site manager himself on arrival. They have been allocated another plot of land than they agreed before, and the kit of the house differed from the agreed one too. And in addition, the group who had hoped to find a completed construction site now had to clear it of vegetation themselves. In fear of the 6 week attendance, 6 weeks attendance period, the task list was ambitious. A wastewater pipe running across the site had to be rerouted. The deposits of earthen material had to be developed, and this had to be examined in the laboratory. The earth blocks had to be prefabricated and finally bricked up. However, what they had not considered at all before was the fact that Cuba was in the worst economic crisis since the revolution, with the collapse of the Soviet Union as its largest trading partner and supporter. The shortage of fuel, transportation capacity, and building materials from steel over cement to a simple tool like a hammer was severe, as Horst Schröder also noted in his report. It was only on the last day of work that the Weimar people managed to erect at least a small section of masonry. As Horst Schröder claimed in his report in a quite paternalistic tone, quote, however, it seemed particularly important to us to achieve just this in order to counteract the skepticism towards this construction method that is still widespread in Cuba. To our satisfaction, the masonry work was completed with great interest from the population of the residential quarter. At least, in his point of view, at least construction methods were taught to the workers of the micro brigade, who were, for example, a dancer of the local opera ballet, as Horst Schröder stated later in an interview. Our colleagues of the micro brigade have learned how to brick, how to hold a trowel, how stiff mortar needs to be, how to interlock a corner, and how to create a masonry board. When I talk to the students who participated in the trip, there's a different perception, also a different motivation in taking part in a project like this one. In order to not go into this aspect too deep right now, I just want to mention the aspect of newly gained freedom, as this was in October 1990. the students and surely also the professor from Weimar felt, as well as the desire of an immersive experience, as you can see in this quote by one of the participating students. Regarding the construction material, one might ask why it was important to build with clay, which was in the end not possible. One was forced to improvise because they didn't find clay there in Cuba, which was, because we didn't find clay in this region. So one was forced to improvise. As they did not find, as they planned clay as a local reserve, they had to use a lime sand material and mix it with cement. With the difficulty of finding cement in Havana at the time, which almost seemed impossible. In the end, they asked neighboring construction sites for it, as they also did with steel. So you could ask why they even came up with the idea of using clay as a local resource if you don't find any clay in that region. The importance of so-called local resources or local traditional techniques is repeatedly emphasized in the report, as it was in the courses and seminars in Weimar before already, and was central to the project. They claimed that this tradition was buried after the revolution, when building was mainly done in lightweight construction and with materials like concrete. Building on a tradition, reviving it, or raising awareness of it among the local population seemed to be intention of the group from Weimar. This experimental building in Cocosoli was supposed to make this contribution. This came together with another circumstance. The experts from GDR certainly had a wealth of knowledge about building with clay to fall back on, as this was one of focus of education in Weimar. So I could say this was more their local tradition they wanted to build on and export. So, but how traditional is earthen construction in Cuba anyway? So not at all, at least not for the last 500 years. What is more, clay is not appropriate to a humid subtropical climate. So we have to state that the Weimar group wanted to implement, or maybe also invent, a tradition, namely clay building technique, which was not used there traditionally, as they wanted to teach self-help building methods, which in Cuba with the micro brigade movement had functioned since 1968, albeit in different ways than the Germans had expected. In the end, the students and their teacher were ready to adapt and improvise as well in adding cement to the soil. But the earth cement mixture, called soil cement, behaved completely different as a building material like clay. Further difficulties and delays were added to the construction process. This showed that they could rely little or not at all on their experience they have gained in Germany. At this point, I also want to add the Cuban perspective as well on this project. The head of the project from the Cuban side, Alfonso Gonzalez, mentioned the motivation of the Cuban members of the planning team to establish the Cocosolo experimental house. Their aim was to establish a prototype which should serve as a model for more soil cement construction works in Cuba in that time. So why this expectation could not be fulfilled either is a completely different story with the local causes and entanglements that I cannot go into this on this point. So lastly, you can ask, was it this story of success or failure? When Horst Schröder came back to Cuba 3 years later, he told me that already a roof was in the making. And when I came back in 23 to visit Cocosolo, I visited a fully inhabited house, which was a 2-story house for 4 families, 4 apartments for families. So we can see Cocosolo is an example of incongruent expectations of the different partners and a very different outcome than expected. Expectations were disappointed and plans had to be modified. Yet Cocosolo construction site ultimately appears, in retrospect, as a place of mutual learning that enabled collaborative architectural production. So thank you very much for your attention.